Sharon Carr. On the morning of June 7, 1992, two boys walking past a cemetery wall in Farnborough, Hampshire, found the body of a young woman who had been left there overnight. Her name was Katie Ratcliffe. She was 18 years old, an apprentice hairdresser, and she had been a complete stranger to the person who took her life. For 2 full years, nobody had any idea who that person was. When the truth finally surfaced, it stunned the detectives who had spent those years looking in entirely the wrong direction. Katie had spent the evening before at a nightclub called Ragamuffins in Camberley, Surrey. She left in the early hours to walk home, the way she had done many times before. Somewhere along that walk, she crossed paths with someone waiting in the dark. She was attacked with a knife and wounded more than 30 times, and she did not survive. Her body was then driven several miles away and left by that cemetery wall, where the boys found her at first light. Because of the nature of the wounds, investigators were certain they were looking for an adult man. They built their entire theory around that single assumption. Detectives interviewed more than 500 men across the region, convinced the person responsible was somewhere in his 20s or 30s. Every lead pointed nowhere. The case went cold, and Katie's family was left without a single answer. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense to a lot of people who follow this case. Exactly 2 years later, on June 7, 1994, a student at Collingwood College attacked a fellow pupil with a knife. The person holding that knife was Sharon Carr, who had still been a schoolgirl at the time Katie Ratcliffe lost her life. In custody after the school attack, Carr began to talk. She boasted about what she had done 2 years earlier in phone calls and across the pages of her own diaries. Staff who saw the writing alerted police, who seized her notebooks. Among the lines she had set down was a chilling admission that she wished she could do it all over again. In plain terms, the breakthrough did not come from forensic science or from those 500 interviews. It came because she could not stop talking about it. One of the detectives who questioned her later described how unsettling she was, recalling that what stayed with him was her complete coldness, an absence of any emotion or reason. Carr was charged in May 1996, 4 years after Katie had been found. Her trial at Winchester Crown Court ran for about a month, and much of the case rested on her own words, the writings, and recorded conversations in which she had described what she had done. The defense argued for the lesser finding of manslaughter, pointing to her youth and her state of mind. The prosecution pressed for the full charge. In March 1997, the jury deliberated for roughly 5 hours before reaching their decision, and they chose the most serious finding available to them. That verdict made Sharon Carr the youngest female in Britain ever convicted of taking a life in this way. The judge, Mr. Justice Scott Baker, called her an extremely dangerous young woman. He also said the evidence suggested she had not acted alone on the night Katie died, and that others had been present when it happened, though the people he believed were involved never stood trial alongside her. She was given a life sentence with a minimum term, reported variously as 12 or 14 years, a tariff generally treated as having expired in 2009. That expiry is the reason her case keeps returning to the parole board year after year. In the years that followed, Carr was held in secure psychiatric hospitals, first Broadmoor and then Rampton, before being returned to prison in 2015 as a restricted status inmate at HMP Bronzefield. She has come before the parole board several times. At her 5th review, reported around February 2026, the board refused to release her, but recommended moving her to open conditions. That recommendation went against the advice of a prison psychologist and of the Justice Secretary's own representative, who wanted her kept in a more demanding closed regime. The final decision rests with the Justice Secretary, David Lammy. As of June 2026, that decision had not been made public, and Carr, now in her mid-40s, remained at Bronzefield. Carr took the life of a stranger she had never met. The young woman in the next case did the opposite. She turned on the two people closest to her, and she did it twice in the space of 9 days. Lorraine Thorpe. Over the course of 9 days in the summer of 2009, in the English town of Ipswich, 2 people lost their lives. One was a woman who had fallen out with Lorraine Thorpe over a dog. The other was Thorpe's own father. By the time it was over, she had become the youngest female in Britain ever convicted of taking 2 lives. In August 2009, Thorpe, still a schoolgirl, was living on the margins of Ipswich alongside a man named Paul Clark, who was more than 40 years old. The two of them moved through a world of instability that most people her age never see. The first victim was a 41-year-old woman named Rosalind Hunt. A falling out, reportedly over a dog, ended with Hunt being drawn into the orbit of Thorpe and Clark. Over a sustained and brutal ordeal, Hunt was attacked and did not survive. Prosecutors would later describe how she had effectively become a prisoner before her death from multiple injuries. Her body was discovered on August 9th, and somehow it got worse. Days later, Thorpe turned on her own father, Desmond Thorpe, a disabled man in his 40s who depended on others for his care. Afraid he would tell police what he knew, she ended his life as he lay defenseless so that he could not speak. His body was found on August 10th, a single day after Hunt's. In the space of barely more than a week, 2 people who knew Lorraine Thorpe had died at her hands. One, a near stranger, and the other, the man who had raised her. The case against her came together through the people around her, rather than through any single piece of forensic evidence. A young friend testified that Thorpe had openly confessed to taking a life, and a fellow inmate said Thorpe had spoken about her father's death on its anniversary, as though marking it. Both Thorpe and Clark denied everything and gave no evidence in their own defense. The jury was not persuaded by their silence. In August 2010, at Ipswich Crown Court, both were convicted. The following month, at the Old Bailey, Thorpe was sentenced to detention with a minimum term of 14 years. The sentencing judge, Mr. Justice Saunders, remarked that she appeared to have taken pride in what she had done. Clark received a life sentence with a minimum of 27 years. The legal story did not end at sentencing. In April 2011, the Court of Appeal upheld the conviction relating to her father's death, rejecting her challenge. Clark would never complete his sentence. He was found dead at HMP Whitemoor in September 2014 in what was believed to be a suicide. Thorpe herself became eligible for parole in 2023. That October, the parole board refused both her release and any move to open conditions. She had declined to take an active part in the review, choosing not to engage with the process that might one day set her free. As of the most recent reporting, Lorraine Thorpe remains held at HM Prison Foston Hall, eligible for future review but still behind closed walls. More than a decade after 2 people in her life lost theirs in the space of a single week. Thorpe's victims at least knew her. The story that follows is about a woman who was failed by nearly everyone around her, and about 2 girls who treated the final hours of her life as something to be photographed and passed around. Girl D and Girl F. On the evening of December 8th, 2014, a woman named Angela Wrightson was caught on a shop camera buying cider, the way she did most days. She was 39 years old. She lived alone on Stephen Street in Hartlepool, and she struggled with addiction and a long list of small offenses. By the next morning, she was gone. What happened to her in the hours in between would lead to one of the most disturbing juvenile cases in recent British history, and to a courtroom battle over whether the public would ever be allowed to know who was responsible. Angela Wrightson was, by every account, a vulnerable person. She had dozens of prior convictions for minor matters and was well known in her community as someone who often had little control over her own circumstances. On that December night, 2 girls came to her home. Both were in the care system, both still of school age, and both, the courts would later hear, carried difficult histories of their own. Over a period that lasted several hours, Angela was subjected to a prolonged and violent attack inside her own home. She suffered more than 100 separate injuries. At one point during that night, one of the girls photographed her and shared the image using a messaging app. To put it plainly, 2 children treated a defenseless woman's worst night as something to broadcast to their friends. By morning, Angela Wrightson had lost her life. Cleveland police arrested both girls on December 9th, the same day Angela was found. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The shop footage showed Angela uninjured earlier that evening, which helped fix the timeline precisely, and the girls' own statements, along with the digital trail they left behind, pointed directly at them. There was little mystery about who had been in the house. Because of their ages, the law shielded their identities from the start. They became known to the public only as Girl D and Girl F. The road to a verdict was not smooth. The first attempt to try them, in the summer of 2015 at Teesside Crown Court, collapsed entirely. The trial judge, Mr. Justice Globe, abandoned it after what he described as an avalanche of prejudicial comment on social media, much of it speculating about who the girls really were and demanding they be named. In that climate, a fair trial had become impossible. A second trial, held the following year in 2016, finally reached a conclusion. Both girls were convicted and sentenced to detention with minimum terms of 15 years each. Mr. Justice Globe kept their anonymity firmly in place, a decision that would itself be tested in the years that followed. The fight over those identities did not stop there. Both girls were later moved into the adult prison system, one of them in April 2018 and the other in March 2019. By 2021, the question of their anonymity had returned to the High Court. Mrs. Justice Tipples granted both of them lifelong anonymity, finding that there was a real and immediate risk that one of them could come to serious harm, including at her own hand, if her identity were ever exposed. As of today, their names remain protected for the rest of their lives, and the public knows them only by 2 letters of the alphabet. Girl D and Girl F harmed a woman who was, to them, almost a stranger of convenience. Across the Atlantic, in a quiet Canadian suburb, 2 sisters were about to do something arguably colder. They sat down and planned the death of the one person who was supposed to be able to trust them completely. Jasmia and Tasmaya Whitehead. Inside the hallway of a juvenile courthouse in Rockdale County, Georgia, a teenage girl turned to face her own mother and said that if she was forced to move back into that house, her mother would not survive it. Several people stood close enough to hear every word, and her grandmother was one of them. As that grandmother later explained, you hear something like that, and a part of you refuses to believe it. So you say nothing, and you go home. 8 days later, the woman that threat had been aimed at was gone, and the 2 people charged in connection with her passing were her own daughters. Jarmeka Whitehead, known to everyone who loved her as Nikki, was 34 years old. She worked as a licensed hairstylist while studying fashion design at Boulder College in Atlanta. She had given birth to identical twin daughters, Jasmia and Tasmita, when she was just 19. and the girls were raised mainly by their great-grandmother. As young children, they were honor roll students and Girl Scouts. That changed after 2007, when Nikki regained custody and moved them into her home in Conyers. Their grades slipped, the household grew tense, and over the next 2 years, the conflict moved out of the living room and into the court system itself. By 2008, police had been called over a physical altercation, and a juvenile court judge formally declared both girls ungovernable. A counselor assigned to the family reportedly told the court this was a household that thrives in chaos. The girls were sent back to their great-grandmother. Then, in late 2009, a judge ordered them returned to Nikki. And on January 5, 2010, the court made the transfer official and set a 2-week trial period. Nikki's mother was so uneasy that she spent the first night on the living room couch, watching a bedroom door that stayed shut. By every signal available, this was a home in crisis. You would think someone might have stepped in. No one did. On the morning of January 13, 2010, the twins slept in and were late for school. Nikki confronted them, and the argument escalated into a violent confrontation inside the home. By the time it was over, Nikki had been harmed fatally, and investigators would later document signs of a prolonged struggle that moved from one room to another. Afterward, the girls gathered up their mother's purse, her phone, and the items involved, sealed them in a plastic bag, and left. They expected to find police already waiting when they came back. There were none. One of the twins flagged down a sheriff's deputy, screaming that something had happened to their mother, and at first the tearful, cooperative girls were treated as witnesses. But the medical examiner concluded almost immediately that this was not the work of a stranger. There was no forced entry, and the violence was deeply personal. Nikki's longtime partner was on the road in Indiana that day and was cleared by DNA, and a second man was cleared by surveillance footage. Then that same kind of footage turned the case. A camera at a gas station across the street had recorded the twins at roughly 10:10 in the morning, squarely inside the window when their mother passed, 2 hours after they claimed to have left for school. Investigators knew then that they were being lied to. In separate follow-up interviews, the girls' demeanor changed completely, and forensic evidence did the rest. A bite mark on Nikki's arm matched Tasmaya through dental molds, and blood turned up on the twins' shoes and on a broken vase from the home. On May 21, 2010, 4 months after their mother's passing, both sisters were arrested, one at the house and one at her high school, and charged as adults. They were held separately so they could not coordinate their accounts. In January of 2014, Tasmaya pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and related charges and was sentenced to 30 years. On February 7th, Jasmaya accepted the same deal and the same sentence. As a condition of those pleas, both sisters gave recorded confessions describing that morning. The judge told the courtroom that the tragedy would never truly end, and that he did not believe there was a single person present whose heart had not been broken. Nikki's mother put it far more simply. She said there were no winners here. By 2016, both sisters had earned their high school equivalency diplomas behind bars and begun coursework toward careers. As of the middle of 2026, Tasmaya is held at Arundel State Prison with a tentative parole month that has already arrived this June, while Jasmaya is at Pulaski State Prison with a tentative parole month set for September of 2027. The longest either could be held is until May 19, 2040. A petition started by a private supporter has since argued for their release, citing claims of past abuse and trauma. It is worth being careful there, because that argument was never raised as a legal defense. and the prosecution did not describe Nikki as an abuser. What the record shows is a household in which everyone had come to fear one another. The Whitehead sisters shared the same age and the same face, and they gave two different accounts of the same morning. So the full truth of what happened in that house may never be settled. At least their story closed with a plea and a sentence. The girl in the case ahead left investigators no such uncertainty about what she had done, because she sat down and wrote it out herself. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. Regina DeFrancisco. Oscar Velasquez was a 22-year-old truck driver in Chicago who believed he had finally met someone worth falling for. He had been seeing a young woman named Regina DeFrancisco for only a few weeks when she invited him to the home she shared with her sister. He walked through that door expecting an evening with his girlfriend. He never walked back out, and by the time anyone found what was left of him, the two sisters were already gone, and their faces were about to appear on national television. A few weeks earlier, Oscar had been an ordinary working man, with no reason to fear the girl he was dating. What he did not know was that the relationship had never been what it seemed. Regina and her sister had reportedly used him once before, tricking him out of around $1,000 in an earlier scheme. On June 6, 2000, they were ready to take far more than money. That night, in the family's Pilsen home, Oscar was lured downstairs. Regina's younger sister, Margaret, was waiting with a handgun that a friend named Veronica Garcia had helped them get hold of. Margaret shot him from behind. The sisters then robbed him of roughly $600, wrapped his body, and loaded it into his own Camaro. They drove the car to a vacant lot, set the body alight using nail polish remover, and later returned to burn the vehicle as well, trying to erase every trace of what they had done. For a while, it looked as though they might succeed, but the trail they thought they had destroyed was still there. Oscar's phone records pointed investigators straight toward Regina, the last person he had been in contact with. Weeks later, a second wave of evidence surfaced when police examined the basement of the sisters' home, where chemical testing revealed blood that had been scrubbed away, along with a spent casing that matched the scene. Bedding recovered from the house was found to match what the body had been wrapped in. Piece by piece, the supposedly perfect cover-up came apart. That was only round one, though. By the time the evidence was solid, the sisters had vanished. Regina and Margaret fled, and their case was profiled on the kind of national crime programs that turn ordinary fugitives into household faces, including America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries. Regina stayed on the run the longest. She was finally caught in Dallas, Texas, in October 2002, after a stolen car incident brought her to the attention of police far from home. Regina went on trial in July 2004. Because the sisters offered competing accounts of who had done what, the court took the unusual step of using two separate juries to hear the case at the same time. Regina was convicted of first-degree murder committed in the course of an armed robbery. Veronica Garcia, the friend who had supplied the weapon, pleaded guilty to concealing the homicide in exchange for a 5-year sentence, and she testified for the prosecution about what she had seen and helped to hide. On September 9, 2004, Regina was sentenced to 35 years. Her appeals went nowhere. Today, she remains incarcerated at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois, where her earliest realistic chance of parole is reported to fall around the year 2037. More than 3 decades after the night Oscar Velasquez accepted an invitation from the woman he trusted. Regina had been the planner, the familiar face who drew Oscar in. But she had not been the one holding the gun. That was her younger sister, and Margaret's journey through the courts would prove even longer than Regina's, in part because a single juror came within one vote of letting her walk out a free woman. Margaret DeFrancisco. Margaret DeFrancisco was the one who pulled the trigger the night Oscar Velasquez lost his life. So how did she come within a single juror's vote of being acquitted altogether, free on bail, while her sister sat convicted? The answer says a great deal about how close some people come to escaping the consequences of what they have done. At the time of the crime, Margaret was the younger of the two sisters, still of school age, and according to the case against her, she had been the one who fired the fatal shot in the basement of their Pilsen home. After the two of them fled Chicago, Margaret did not get as far as Regina. She was tracked down in the Rockford area of Illinois in March 2002, months before her sister was caught in Texas. When the sisters were tried in the summer of 2004, each had her own jury. Regina's jury convicted her. Margaret's did not. 11 of the 12 jurors wanted to find her guilty. One did not. That single holdout meant a hung jury, no verdict at all, and Margaret was released on bail, free for a time despite being the accused shooter. For the family of Oscar Velasquez, watching the person who had fired the gun walk out of that courtroom must have been almost unbearable. You'd think someone would have found a way to keep her in custody. Nobody did. She remained free until the state could bring her back for a second trial. The prosecution did not give up. Margaret was retried, and the second jury reached the verdict the first one had not. In late 2004, she too was convicted of first-degree murder. On December 14, 2004, Margaret was sentenced to 46 years, 11 years longer than her sister. The heavier sentence reflected her role as the person who had actually taken Oscar's life. Like Regina, she is held at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois, listed in state records under an inmate number that will follow her for decades. Her realistic parole eligibility is reported to fall around the year 2050, by which point she will have spent the overwhelming majority of her life behind bars. Both sisters remain in prison today, their appeals exhausted, separated from the world for a crime they committed before either of them was old enough to vote. What began as a scheme to take a young man's money ended with 2 sentences that will hold them well into old age, and with a family that lost a son and a brother over roughly $600 and a car. The DeFrancisco sisters were chasing money. Revenge was what drove the young woman whose story comes next, an older and far more dangerous motive, and she settled her gang's debt with a kiss. Jacqueline Montanez. She walked up to him in a Chicago park, leaned in, and kissed him. Seconds later, that same young woman took his life. Jacqueline Montanez was a teenage member of a street gang when she helped carry out a double act of revenge that would make her the first girl in Illinois ever sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison. And yet, decades later, she would walk free and stand in front of crowds, asking young people not to become her. In the spring of 1992, Montanez, still a teenager, belonged to a gang called the Maniac Latin Disciples. A member of her gang had recently lost his life, and on the street the expectation was that the score would be settled. On May 12, 1992, Montanez and 2 others, 21-year-old Marilyn Mulero and a younger companion named Madeline Mendoza, lured 2 rival gang members, 22-year-old Hector Reyes and 21-year-old Jimmy Cruz, to Humboldt Park. The plan was disguised as something friendly. Montanez approached Hector Reyes, kissed him, and then, in a park washroom, took his life. Jimmy Cruz lost his life moments later. 2 young men were gone in the space of a few minutes, the victims of a revenge that had nothing to do with them as individuals and everything to do with the colors they wore. Montanez was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Because of the seriousness of the charge, she was automatically tried as an adult, despite her youth. There was a serious problem with how her case had been handled, though. Her confession had been taken without a youth officer or parent present, a violation that became the center of a long legal dispute. The matter was contested for years, and she was retried in 1999, where she was convicted once again. The sentence was mandatory life without the possibility of parole. That made Jacqueline Montañez the first girl in Illinois ever given a juvenile life without parole sentence. And for years, she was the only woman in the entire state serving one. As a teenager, she had been told, in effect, that she would die in prison. Then the law itself changed. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the case of Miller versus Alabama that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional, and Illinois applied that ruling to old cases. With help from a legal clinic at Northwestern University, Montanez was brought back before a judge. On October 14, 2016, Cook County Judge Alfredo Maldonado resentenced her to 63 years, to be served at half that length. He described the deaths as a senseless tragedy, but said she was not among the rarest of juvenile offenders who could never be redeemed. The daughter of Hector Reyes opposed her release. In 2022, after roughly 31 years behind bars, Jacqueline Montañez walked out of prison. She became a youth advocate, working with a justice reform organization and speaking openly about her past. She has stated repeatedly in writing that she acted alone that day in the park, a claim that carries weight because one of her co-defendants later became a high-profile, wrongful conviction case tied to a discredited detective. As of today, Montañez remains free, one of the very few people in this story to have been given a second chance at a life on the outside. Montañez took the lives of strangers in the name of a gang. The violence in the case that follows was aimed inward, at the 2 people who had raised one teenage girl, and what she did in the hours afterward still stops people cold. She went shopping. Cynthia Alvarez. After the 2 people who had raised her were gone, Cynthia Alvarez climbed into a vehicle and went out shopping for Halloween party supplies. In the back of that same vehicle was the body of her mother. The case that unfolded inside a Compton mobile home would become one of the most disturbing family tragedies in recent California memory. And it began with a teenager who decided her parents had stood in her way for the last time. In the autumn of 2011, Alvarez was a teenager living in a mobile home in Compton, California, with her mother, 58-year-old Gloria Villalta, and her stepfather, 51-year-old Jose Lara. Her parents disapproved of her relationship with her boyfriend, Giovanni Gallardo, who was also still a teenager. Alvarez would later say she had additionally made allegations of abuse against her stepfather. Whatever the full picture, the 2 of them began to plan something that no family disagreement could ever justify. Sometime around the middle of October 2011, Gallardo arrived at the home carrying the tools the pair had decided they would need. Gloria Villalta was attacked and did not survive. When Jose Lara came home, he was ambushed and fatally harmed as well. The teenagers then loaded the bodies into a vehicle and drove them away, burying Jose in Long Beach. And then, with Gloria still in the vehicle, they went shopping for party supplies, as though it were any other afternoon. Both bodies were later recovered from shallow graves. At first, the scene looked like a burglary gone wrong. The home had been ransacked. and there was nothing obvious pointing back at the family itself. The case broke open from an unexpected direction. Gallardo's own mother brought the two teenagers to the police, and once they were questioned, admissions followed. Investigators also recovered a spiral notebook the pair had used to communicate in writing, a record of what they had been planning laid down in their own hands. Both were charged on October 21st, 2011, and both were charged as adults, with special circumstances that included lying in wait and the taking of more than one life. The two were tried separately. Alvarez took the stand in her own defense and told the jury that she had been a victim and that Gallardo had acted alone. The jury did not accept her account. After only about 4 hours of deliberation, they convicted her on both counts of first-degree murder in the spring of 2013. Gallardo was convicted as well. In January 2014, the sentences came down. Alvarez was given 51 years to life. Gallardo received life without the possibility of parole. Prosecutors had chosen not to seek the death penalty against either of them because of how young they had been. Both remain in California state custody today. For Cynthia Alvarez, the 51-year minimum means she will not even be eligible to ask for parole until she is well into old age. The mobile home in Compton, the shallow graves, and the shopping trip with her mother in the back of the vehicle remain among the details that the investigators who worked the case have never been able to forget. Alvarez was convicted on confessions and a notebook written in her own hand. The final case in this story left behind something far harder to argue with. There was a recording, and unlike every other young woman you have heard about so far, her fate has not yet been settled. It is being decided in a courtroom right now. Carly Madison Gregg. On an ordinary afternoon in March 2024, a kitchen security camera in a quiet Mississippi home recorded something no family ever expects to capture. It caught the moment a teenage girl took her mother's life, and it caught the sound of the shots. What it could not capture was the question that would reach the state's highest court 2 years later and still go unanswered: whether Carly Gregg truly understood what she was doing. Carly Madison Gregg was a teenager living in Brandon, in Rankin County, Mississippi, with her mother, 40-year-old Ashley Smiley, a high school math teacher, and her stepfather, Heath Smiley. On March 19th, 2024, her mother discovered cannabis and vaping items in her room. What might have been an ordinary moment of discipline turned, within minutes, into something that could never be undone. Gregg retrieved a pistol and shot her mother, who did not survive. When her stepfather arrived home a short time later, she shot him as well, wounding him in the shoulder. He managed to wrestle the weapon away from her, and she fled the house, only to be caught about half a mile away. Before her stepfather got home, she had texted a teenage friend and asked her to come over, and when the friend arrived, Gregg showed her what she had done. The kitchen camera had recorded the shooting along with the audio of the shots, evidence that left little doubt about the sequence of events. The friend later testified that Gregg had admitted firing at her mother several times, and that Gregg had told her she heard voices. Gregg was tried as an adult in a 5-day trial in Rankin County Circuit Court before Judge Dewey Arthur. She pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. A defense psychiatrist testified that she suffered from depression and auditory hallucinations. The state's own expert disagreed, concluding that she did not meet Mississippi's legal standard for insanity. On September 20th, 2024, after a little over 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and tampering with evidence. She had turned down a plea offer that would have meant a single 40-year sentence. One of the prosecutors said afterward that in a case like this, there were no winners. The sentence was severe. She received 2 life terms, one for her mother and one for the attempt on her stepfather, along with 10 years for tampering, all ordered to run at the same time. But Carly Gregg's case is not finished. Her first appeal, which argued that the defense had been ambushed over an expert witness, was rejected by the Mississippi Court of Appeals. A broader appeal then went to the Mississippi Supreme Court, raising questions about the jury instructions on insanity, about whether a life sentence for someone so young is even constitutional, and about how the prosecution had argued its case. The court heard oral arguments on May 27, 2026. One of the justices openly questioned whether her sentence truly amounts to life without parole at all. As of early June 2026, no ruling had been issued. For now, Gregg is held at a youthful offender facility within a Mississippi correctional complex, while the courts decide whether her conviction stands, is overturned, or is sent back for a new sentence. These 10 young women followed very different paths into the same kind of headline. Some will spend the rest of their lives in prison, some have already walked free, and one is still waiting on a court to decide her future. As of today, that is exactly where each of these stories stands. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.